Welcome to Cypher After Hours. I'm Brett Stewart, here with my co-hosts, Emily and David, and we're going to continue the discussion we've been having on Thoth. The remote viewing session data continues because a lot of the other individuals that were listening to the monitored cowboy session had questions for Thoth. We're going to get into those, as well as what Thoth not only thought about RV, but more about things beyond RV. He took a look at why they may not be possible. So, Emily, I know you took a look at this. Where is a good place to start?
Yeah, so I'd just like to set the stage here for the listener to understand that when we're interacting with this being known as Thoth, it's important to picture ourselves, there's this timeline, and we have to think about where Brett may have been interacting with this being on the timeline, sort of in the correct context. So we have to think about where Brett might be interacting with this being across a timeline, and it seems like Brett's definitely interacted at various points. We don't know quite why he interacts at these points, but it provides for an interesting understanding or discovery actually about Earth.
So I do think this is important when looking at the data holistically, because certainly when I was looking at the life form, the incarnated human that is buried in a tomb, that was very clear ancient human history, likely unrecorded, long time ago. It predates what we know happened. However, this other force that's associated with this life form that had this kind of parental view of humanity and the Earth, and it was trying to help Earth grow and evolve, that I was asked by the monitor, where are they now? And I got this idea of being in deep space, but part of me feels that what I was actually communicating with was that force at the time of the incarnated human. And the reason why I have that belief is due to one of the answers that it gave me as a result of what's next after remote viewing. It's like, oh, this is so nice. Humans are deciding to use remote viewing and communicate non-physically with other beings in the universe. I'm so proud of you. That was that was the vibe I was getting from it. But when we asked it about, well, what's next? What do you want to do next? And it said, well, you have to decide what that is. Do you want teleportation is a cool one, or domination and power? Is that your gig? Or do you like healing? Someone said, well, what's this teleportation thing since you brought it up? What's that about? And the answers that we got made it seem like it wasn't aware of what was going on around Earth in present time. It feels like this life form is spread out over time, and I happen to be communicating with it in the distant past. And time, I feel, is all relative with remote viewing. You can go outside of time, forward in time, backward in time. It really doesn't matter, but it's relevant where we're looking at it because of the answers that were given.
This goes back to this analogy about mushrooms, right? There's this big thoth-like thing outside of time, behind the curtain, behind the scenes. It's popping up in prehistory. It's popping up in all this more recent, and by more recent, I mean the last couple thousand years, more recent literature that we've got that's attributed to Thoth. It's, according to my cowboy session with Thoth, it was actually, you could read any book and find little bits of that coming through. So it's always there, and sometimes you'll get a real big solid whack of it, like the Emerald Tablets or the two different versions of the incarnation that Brett's been interacting with here. During that session, as soon as Thoth said teleportation, I think we were all like, well, we have to ask about that. Let's forget the practical stuff. Teleportation? Cool. So what did Thoth have to say about teleportation that made you think that maybe this was an interaction in the past relative to us?
Well, it's funny because he actually had two answers. His first answer was really straightforward. It's simple. You just copy yourself by holding a picture of yourself somewhere else in your mind, as clear as you can. And then eventually, if you do that long enough, you will be in both places at the same time. And that sounds a little bit like remote viewing. You have sustained attention on a topic in a structured format. You start getting information about it.
This just made me think of this idea that the Thoth Atlantis story that you've been interacting with here might be on a different plane of existence, like a higher plane that's less physical. So when we do other modalities like ERV or magical stuff where we are projecting a point of awareness elsewhere, that it is pretty much that easy, right? We just go, I'm going there. And we can do things like these cowboy sessions or ERV where we don't even know where we're going. We still go there. Maybe that's the difference. I don't know. It was just a thought that popped into my head as you said that.
Well, tying it back to some of your work that you had in previous sessions on the time and space of human civilization during the Rykot structure, the plane itself was fundamentally different which is why consciousness was different. What if back in this ancient period where Thoth was incarnated here, and when in time I was interacting with this non-physical form of it, that's the way things actually did operate, is that humans back then, that if they could just get their monkey mind settled for long enough, they actually could do this. It would be that easy. It is actually that easy. So what happened next, though, is I just responded, well, listen, I've done intense meditations where I put considerable time and thought on seeing myself in another location, and I never was there physically. Maybe I'm a novice at it. I don't know the trick. So we asked, what's the trick? And back to his little tablet, his little notepad that looked like a computer screen. Every time he's like, let me look at the universal database 1 second. What's going on here? And then Thoth had a surprised reaction at what he found. And what I perceived him saying was, there's something around Earth that shouldn't be there. There's an external force that I wasn't aware of, which is, again, this is why I thought maybe I'm at a kind of strange point in time with Thoth, that he wasn't aware that this force was there, and it wasn't there before. As he's looking at his tablet, he's saying this thing blocks energy and things that would have been available to humans in the past. But the presence, and it showed me this picture of like some sort of like a thick fog surrounding the planet, preventing light from reaching the surface. And it looked like something was grabbing Earth. To be honest, Thoth was grossed out by it. He's like, this is parasitic. It's a drain. And then he said, this will not do. As far as the reason why it didn't work the way he expected it, that's what immediately came up.
So, Brett, would you say this is like a physical thing that Thoth was describing? Like a physical, some of us could picture as like dark clouds, or would there be maybe more of a kind of a metaphysical explanation for this?
I think that there's probably physical forces and influence as a result of this, but it felt absolutely non-physical. It felt like a force or an energetic force that Thoth was describing as parasitic. And it's getting in the way of allowing humans to get in touch with, or at least it's trying it by dint of it being here. It's obstructing what humans have the potential to be and do in their natural state.
So if prehistoric space Thoth was not aware of this, or this wasn't there at the time, if we consider that the Emerald Tablets might be some kind of indirect manifestation of this Thoth effect, even though that was being written down in the second half of the first millennium AD. In Tablet 2, it says, the children of men in their bondage, bound by the force that came from beyond, which sounds very ominous, and it goes on and on about this dark force. That sounds very eerily familiar, doesn't it? So I guess later Thoth is aware of this phenomenon, if this is what's being written about here.
Yeah, and this is why the timeline is important to get our ducks in order. I seem to have, in my RV session, gone further back and to a point to where he wasn't aware that this was occurring now. So it's all about perspective. Is that now, well, why couldn't you teleport? What makes this more difficult? Since we meditate, nothing happens. It's because there's another force here that is perhaps binding the children of men.
There are some reports that I think are more like astral projection or something, of people physically materializing and people waking up in the night and seeing their spouse who's like halfway around the world as they're shimmering away in a mysterious way in their bedroom. And there's one really famous case of this. I think the guy was posted abroad on military service or something, and he kept turning up back at home, and in the end his wife wrote him a letter and said, can you stop doing it? You keep waking me up in the night with these creepy apparitions. And he wasn't a magician or anything. It was just happening spontaneously.
Yeah, I know there's another story. I don't remember her name, but there's a famous figure from Europe, a Mother Teresa type individual, where she would go help the homeless, help the poor. And there are stories of her showing up in South America, helping a tribe. They drew her picture, they had her name, they had everything. Like she just showed up there and she stayed for a while and then left. But it's like she was in both places at the same time. And how that happened, I wish I remember her name, but there are stories of this actually occurring where it's almost like someone made a copy of themselves and projected that somewhere else on the planet. And that's kind of like what Thoth was asking. It's like, do you want to learn how to make a copy of yourself? That's what teleportation is. It's like, oh no, there's two versions.
I know that your session, Brett, also had some how-tos from Thoth on ways that people can overcome this force, and clearly people are already doing that. Do you want to share with the listener a couple of the tips that he had?
The way Thoth set this up for me, and the way that I understood it, he said, you've lost your connection. You need to reestablish your connection with Source. See, as I've heard this before in other areas as well. It's like you need enough intensity to punch your way through the fog, that this parasitic kind of oppressive force that's binding men, that you need enough juice to kind of puncture a hole through to get to the outside. And that's where the energy, and that's where you'd be able to tune into something to act as a battery to help you do things here, manifest things here, do miracles here, things of that nature. And he said that right now it does look like it would be possible for people to do this. It's just not easy. But one of the how-tos, one of the tips he said is it's easier during epochal times, that there are specific points in times when this force is weakened or lessened. And he used a couple examples of things like the equinox, a blood moon, the Passover, times where the planet is in turmoil or there's something really big astrologically occurring. It's like it leaves little gaps in the oppressive force where you could reach out through that fog and pull back what would be required to do these kinds of things.
So I know there's times where I've definitely felt when there is this thinning of a veil, say it's a blood moon or even a full moon, where I'm sure the listener can relate as well. You've all had experiences where you feel maybe connected to a higher power. You are more sensitive to negative energies of others. If you're normally not so sensitive, you might be able to perceive other people's sort of bad energies. You might feel called to do something you don't normally do, like compelled to do a certain action. And there's certainly reports of things like enhanced paranormal activity and also a lot of synchronicities. People report that there are synchronicities at these times. So all those phenomenon might actually be wrapped up in what Thoth is telling us about this thinning of the veil. And maybe during those times, we can actually learn to harness those energies. And I know that's part of what happens in witchcraft and in other forms of magic as well, to harness these special times for particular purposes.
Well, not just overtly magical practices. Look at the major religions. The whole religious calendars are built around phases of the moon and astrological things. It isn't necessarily advertised that that's the case, but it is.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. It makes me think about holidays in a slightly different way. Why would we need a record? The joy and the entertainment and the societal nurturing aspect is one thing, but maybe there's another reason, a deeper reason of why these holidays would exist as part of society. People coming together with their energy. This is what Thoth was saying, is that during these epochal times that the grip around Earth is loosened, it's pried open a bit. And he said, look for those times and moments to reconnect to source. That's what will give you the ability. That's where, in fact, you get all of your ability from anyways. You are a channeler of power, not the power source. If you lose your connection to the battery, you won't work. It's really that simple.
Is there any other advice that Thoth had for us on the subject of self-improvement?
He said, pray. And then he laughed a bit. just pray for help from source. But beyond that, he did say other things that will help with this is to what he considered live a moral life, be ethical, reject sin, and the energy of source will find you so that you will also even be able to live a better life. And this is where he gets into the description of what we are as opposed to the how we do what we do, because he described that we are like an avatar for higher energies, but we have to be receptive to those energies first to do any of these things that are possible for us. And so what he said is, you can do things beyond your imagination, but you won't be in the driver's seat at that point. It will be source that drives through you. You are a vessel for source energy. That is how you can get through the smog, through the smoke that surrounds the planet. There's not enough energy here naturally to do so, or at least it's very rare. You need a direct source intervention for that to occur. And I think he was referring to teleportation at this point, because that's what was being asked originally. It's like, oh, you want to teleport somewhere? That there's not enough energy for you to really do that unless you had a direct source connection. He then a little cheekily added, though, but at that point, your motivations would likely change from silly things like teleportation, and they'd shift to other things like trying to heal the world.
That reminds me almost how a teacher would feel when they have a very keen student or a very eager student to learn things. It's sort of the teacher feeds off of that positive student's energy.
Yeah, I haven't had any interaction on this level like that before. It was just like this kind of giddy, fun, excited, proud, like a parent interaction. It certainly was not a god looking to be worshipped. I'll tell you that much. Like, it would probably find great disdain if you worshipped Thoth or you worshipped him. He's more of a mentor instructor type of energetic force is the vibe that I got.
So what you're really describing here, Brett, reminds me of the Buddhist notion of the siddhis, which are these apparent magical powers that someone can achieve by perhaps meditating, following certain religious practices, and so on. And the interesting catch-22 with these is that you might think, okay, well, it's going to be really cool if I can teleport and then I can show off to all my friends, all my cool magical powers. Maybe I can even levitate. It's a fun party trick. And where that's coming from within us is it's more of an ego thing, right? Why do you want to do all this? Well, you want to do all this because you want to elevate your ego. And the interesting thing about being able to achieve these magical powers that are very real, but also require a high level of energy from perhaps source, they also require this power to sort of work through you and for you to let go of your ego. And so by the time you get to this point of being able to do these things, it's not that important to you to show off your friends. It's sort of like, oh, this is a cool thing I can do, but I'm at a sort of a different place in my spiritual life, for lack of a better description, a different energy vibration that now doesn't find these magical powers all that special because there's way more stuff that is worth pursuing.
There's something that I've read about and I've heard about, especially in the New Age community, where there's this idea of you need to dissolve or abolish your ego to access higher levels of enlightenment and all these other things. And to be perfectly honest, that really doesn't make any sense to me. Like, the ego has a role. It's just right now the ego for a lot of people is driving the car. And I think what Thoth was trying to impart upon me is that the ego is not something that's negative. It's something that's been useful. In fact, the ego is the thing that's got you to where you are today. You wouldn't be here if the ego wasn't doing its job. It was doing the best that it could up to a certain point. But when it's talking about what your true nature is, to be a vessel for a higher power, for source energy, and that once you tune into that and you tap into that through this veil and you bring that here, that your inclinations and your automatic behavior, what your desires are, will change just by the fact that you're channeling or becoming an avatar for something bigger than you. And it sounds very almost religious to a point, but I don't think it needs to be. I think this is just a dint of who and what we are as something that can take in energy and express it on this plane of existence. And it's just, what are we deciding to do? Are we using our own local energy to create and manifest? Can we tap into something much bigger? And this is what Thoth was recommending, is that there's a bigger battery out there. If you want to have a bigger impact, use the bigger battery, but it will certainly influence kind of the motivations. But I mean, source energy is going to give you positive motivations, so it's not like you're giving up anything.
Well, it's a little paradoxical because it's not going to give you that, right? Because the you that is starting off going, I'm going to learn to teleport because it's going to impress my friends, that's not going to be there at this hypothetical point in the future where that's a possibility. And that egoic, physical, selfish, self-centered version of you which wants that stuff is going to have to get out of the way in order to enable that kind of thing to happen.
I think it's perspective, because you could view it as you're losing that part, but you could also view it differently as you're transforming that part. Because I think what Thoth was imparting, by tuning into this energy, that you naturally would want to change your desires. The desires that move you to action would change just by default of what you're in alignment with. And when you're in alignment with this higher source, you naturally want to do different things. And so there's no overriding, because you choose to go in alignment. And once you choose to go in alignment, your natural way of being is the expression of what you're in alignment with. And so I think from the ego perspective, it looks like, my decision and free will is being violated if I go into alignment with this thing. And I think that's just a misconstruing of what's actually going on. What we are by default is an avatar. We are something that can express through, energy can express through us. We don't lose ourselves in that. We just have the ability to express it. So it's a really nuanced thing, I feel, but it's an important distinction, because it's really easy to get lost down the, it's overpowering me and taking my free will, therefore I don't want to touch it, when I really don't think that's what's going on.
So a really interesting analogy came to mind. The way I think about this is almost like when you're a little kid and you find out there's this thing called chocolate or candy bars, You're like, this is super. I like these. And then your parents might not give you those at every meal and say, okay, you can have this small allotment. And then you look at your parents, they have money and they go buy all the food. And you're like, when I grow up, I'm going to eat only candy bars because they're the best and I'll be in charge of buying the food and I can go get candy bars. But then by the time you grow up, you realize sort of those are not things you should be eating. You sort of get to a level of maturity, hopefully, where you realize you should be eating healthier food. And that's kind of how I would relate, at least in my own mind, to what Brett's describing here. Is it's sort of like you haven't really lost anything as an adult. It's sort of a maturation process that gives you a different perspective.
I think a process is a really good way to look at it. Carl Jung said that you spend the first 30 years of your life developing a healthy ego and then the following 30 years deconstructing it. And there's this idea of self-transcendence, that the ego eventually realizes that something's up and that it needs to self-examine. And at some point, you kind of dismantle yourself through the process of self-examination and introspection and meditation. And the Buddhists would say, you recognize the illusory nature of the self. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, everyone's familiar with. What's the top level called, Brett? Self-actualization. Everybody thinks that one's the top, and it's not. Later in life, when people weren't paying attention to him anymore, Maslow added another layer on top, which was the self-transcendence layer, presumably after he'd finished that second 30 years of his life and deconstructed his own ego and gone, oh, there was more to it. But this, just to go back to egoic desire cities, this happens in magic. I mean, some people go into magic for the spiritual self-transcendence, self-knowledge kind of reasons, but then there's people with maybe more base goals for it. They want all of the sex and power and money and drive fast cars and punish their enemies and all of these egoic desires which sort of stem from a dualistic as opposed to a non-dual outlook. And they maybe go through all of these learning systems and they do their meditation and their prayer and all the rest of it. And they end up going through this self-transcendence process and they come out the other end of it a completely transformed person who doesn't care for any of the stuff that got them in there in the first place. It's this hilarious bait and switch. But I don't think in any of these examples that we've given, there's no point when anybody's free will is being overridden. It's not some kind of asceticism. Faking it will not work. You don't just deny yourself things and suddenly God will give you powers. Not at all. You develop yourself and those desires will fall away as you recognize their illusory nature.
It wasn't lost on me when thoth said, what are you interested in learning more about after remote viewing? And the very first thing that he offered was, do you want to know how to destroy others? Do you want to know how to enslave them and take power and destroy? And it's like, that was the first little, it was almost like a little test for everyone there. It's like, is this what you're interested in? Because you can. And I got the sense that that was fine if that's what you were interested in. It's probably not what he'd wish us to choose, but it is an option available. And I'm sure there are learnings in that if that's what someone wishes to pursue. And it's the kind of thing I look at where it's okay to want the house on the hill. Say you don't have it and you look at it and it's like, oh, I really want the house on the hill. But the more enlightened you become, maybe having that house on the hill because of the reasons of it's to show off, it's to brag, it's to feel better than everybody else. Those reasons change, but maybe even it's the same goal as you become more open or become more of an avatar for these higher powers that are transcendental in nature. And maybe you want the house now because it's a place that you can create meeting spaces for others to help them in their journey in life. And that's why now you want the house on the hill. So it's almost like the actual teleportation or the city isn't necessarily, there's not an evil associated with it. It's how do you view it? Do you idolize it? Are you doing it for the sake of having it? And is it an egoic desire? Usually one that puts you above others. I'm sure there's lessons to be learned in that, but I feel like Thoth gave us a little bit of a test by offering that one first. We didn't take it, I guess. So that's good.
Nobody took the bait. I don't know if anybody was biting their tongue, but I wasn't. Well, it's just not a good idea doing that stuff. I don't think. But like you say, to each their own. All roads lead to Rome, right? I think Thoth also said, you are an avatar for source energy when you're doing this, which is a really good model. You see that with this ego transcending stuff, like in Western magic from the Crowley schools, you've got the union with the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, which I believe was deliberately given quite a silly name, but it is opening up to the higher aspect of ourselves and becoming more kind of connected to source, divinity, whatever you want to call it. In Buddhism, I suppose enlightenment would be completely shedding off ignorance, which in that nomenclature I think includes coming to realize that everything is illusory, including self, and therefore your free will is not really your free will. You just think it is. And there is only one will in the universe, and that's the divine will. So you're sitting there thinking, I'm going to get a sports car and zap my enemies with magic and going to do all this stuff. And that's really the divine will guiding you gently towards self-transcendence. And you think you're thinking about sports cars, what do you know?
Children playing in the sand.
Yeah. It's like with children, if you want them to do something, you don't say, do this. You say, do you want to wear your blue shoes or your green shoes today? And then suddenly it's reframed, there's the illusion of choice.
So I'd like to take the conversation back to something that Brett touched on earlier, and that is that Thoth also gave us some understandings of sin and what is sin. I know that a lot of people out there who have a particular religious practice, they may have religious leaders in their practice talking about what sin is. There's certainly a lot of spiritual texts written about sin and certain rules that one has to follow or not follow. But Brett, why don't you tell the audience, what did Thoth have to say about sin in particular, and how can we, as individuals who might want to follow his teachings, act in the world to be, for lack of a better word, good people?
When asked about the way or manner with which we could access source energy, he said, live a moral life, be ethical, reject sin. And then someone asked as a question, well, what do you define as sin? And he had a very simple answer. The first thing he did is he showed me a visual of scales. And I think this is rather on point in regards to who Thoth was and the visual imagery that you see in ancient Egyptian depictions of him. Thoth is often associated with, he's the scribe standing next to the scales, judging someone's life and their deeds. And what Thoth said after he showed me the scale, do more good and bring more good into the world. That must outweigh the bad that you bring into the world. And the monitor asked, is that it? And he said, yes. Does it need to be more complex? Be a net positive, not a net negative. Everyone messes up. That's fine. Just bring more good. It's not that complicated.
I think that in many organized religions, we see all these really exotic rules around how one can be good and how one can be bad. And there's a lot of judgment associated with these things. But I think at the core of it, if we really connect with source and with our inner feelings, there's no real surprise here. What Thoth is saying, it just sort of makes sense. It's sort of you're guided by this. And if you're told, I have a challenge for the audience. If you're told by someone that you have to judge an individual based on this or that, or you have to do a particular set of actions, otherwise you're a bad person or you're a sinner, these people probably are not leading you in a very good place. And I know that may be a bit controversial, but I think that it's something that you should definitely be skeptical of when a religious leader says you can't act this way or you should hate these people.
Well, I would like to play divine devil's advocate and say that we are all sinners, because there are esoteric definitions of sin which are simpler than all the rules, right? That sin is simply the impulse away from the divine. So it's all the material stuff, all the material distractions, going out partying and dancing in fast cars and all the rest of it that you find sometimes specific religious prohibitions against. But it's not because those things are evil or bad, but it's because they keep you attached to the illusion. They keep you stuck. So you're either continuing to go down or you're staying at the bottom. You're not making that journey back up towards divinity and kind of getting closer to that stuff. So it's not that sin is inherently evil. It's just that it's the act of going the wrong way. It's not even the wrong way. There's only one way you can go in the end, right? But it's failing to make progress. So that's another lens on it.
Well, the objects themselves that are often organized religions as stay away, don't do. If you want to move up in the world and in the spiritual world. I feel like the meaning behind those messages was lost a long time ago. Is that, oh, don't beautiful women, amazing physical objects, you must burn it all and lead a life of squalor. And that's being holy. And I think the original intention behind that was that you can get lost in those things, especially if you idolize them. And then that can lead you to creating probably more net negative consequences and actions and energy in the world. So therefore, their solution for the simple-minded is just don't engage. But that message is lost to time. It's like people are doing the ceremony or they're doing the ritual and they've forgotten why. When the original core concept, the original reason was so that they could still have this scale balanced towards the good. And I think that's what Thoth was alluding to here.
So just a second, what Brett said, that there are these vices out there that are said by religious leaders or spiritual teachings, oh, don't engage in these particular vices. It's not about the vices. You actually can engage in the vices. It's more just these particular things, if you're not doing them with discernment, like we've talked about in even our previous episode, the importance of discernment, how they could trigger you to go down a path that ends up creating that balance more in the direction of doing bad things on balance over the good things. But there isn't any particular thing that applies to any particular individual as a hard and fast rule. It's really just up to the individual to chart their own course.
As well as discernment, you could say you can engage in all of these things mindfully. There is a school of thought, and I forget this guy's name, but he's a famous and controversial spiritual teacher who had all his disciples like having sex parties and drinking loads of alcohol and had them dressing up in military fatigues and stuff and doing all this crazy stuff. And the idea was, it's kind of, if get it out of your system. If you want to smoke cigarettes until you're sick of smoking, and then you will have understood the urge to smoke cigarettes inside you and gone, actually, this sucks. I don't want to smoke anymore because I've worked out my smoking karma or whatever it is. You know, that you've got to just do it, but do it in a way that's beneficial, that helps your development rather than kind of spiraling down and getting stuck in it. And the topic of sin, you can look at it on different levels, like so many of these sort of spiritual subjects. There's the exoteric. Do good things. Don't steal things from your neighbors. Don't cheat on your partner. Don't be an asshole. It's fairly self-explanatory. But then you can also look at it as well, when you're compassionate towards others, you create this whole positive knock-on effect. The world's a better place. You don't create more sin, or you don't make yourself more heavy and stuck. And when it comes to the heart weighing in the Egyptian afterlife, Thoth won't be there writing down lots of sad faces. And if you're compassionate towards others, you change yourself, right? There's an esoteric reason for being nice as well as an exoteric one. It makes civilization and life nicer. That's the world we want to live in, right? Where people are cool. But then you're actually making spiritual progress yourself when you follow those rules. So there's a double, or probably a triple whammy of reasons.
So the Egyptians actually had a principle that they referred to as Mayet that embodied what we're talking about here. Mayet was the wife of Thoth and represented truth, justice, and sort of a narrow path that one can walk in life. So she, if we picture in our minds that she was basically represented by a feather, and her feather was the measure that determined whether souls of the departed, of people that passed on, would reach paradise in the afterlife. So it's basically an ancient Egyptian teaching of a lot of the things that are baked into our modern religions about walking a certain straight and narrow path, and that you're going to be judged and weighed, but maybe not quite in the ways that the religious leaders like to present these things to us.
And it was the heart of the deceased was put on the scale and weighed against the feather. And if it was heavier, then it meant that they had essentially brought more negative into the world through their life and their intentions than positive.
So this idea of the heart weighed against the feather, you can take it as a bank balance of good and bad deeds and a did you follow the rules kind of thing at the exoteric level. But on the esoteric level, you can look at it as attachment to sin again. Did you die with resentment in your heart, with jealousy and all this dualistic stuff? Are you going to become a hungry ghost now because you couldn't let go of things that are earthly. So there's this esoteric meaning to it as well, like all these symbols that can be interpreted at multiple levels. It's a fractal, just like the emerald tablets of Thoth tell us the universe is. I think that's enough sin for now. We've had a fill of sinning. So, Brett, could you tell us next, what did Thoth say about healing and health?
Yeah, so this was one of the final questions that the audience asked of Thoth. And someone asked the question, you talked about healing. Is there a way we can learn to do this just like we learn remote viewing? And how Thoth responded, first it was visual. I saw something appear in his hand and it looked like a crystal, just like an ordinary crystal, fairly large size one that you might find at any kind of, I don't know, new age shop. And he was describing it as that this is how you can do this much more easily. That crystals, and I'm like semi-laughing here because at this point in time, I thought crystals were all nonsense. And here I am having a conversation with a potential ancient deity telling me that crystals are how you can heal people. But he described it as the crystal acts as a repository, a larger battery than you can normally hold within yourself. The crystal will turn your intent and energy into something like a laser with which you can direct.
So it's interesting you mentioned lasers and crystals, because as far as I understand how lasers work, they actually use crystals to focus a beam of light and make them basically diffuse light into something super powerful. So it's not only metaphorically true, but this is also physically true in terms of how lasers actually work. It's pretty interesting.
I think it's the doping within the crystals emits the light, like you have flash lamp pumped lasers where there's just a broad spectrum. I think it's literally called a pump, a big flash of light. And then the atoms inside the crystal all kind of resonate together at this one coherent frequency. So it's like ringing a bell almost. It's pretty cool. And it's a good analogy for this too.
Well, that fits with, I don't know much about crystals or lasers, and it makes sense. The descriptions of it make sense. But someone else then asked, well, what kind of crystals should we use? And what I perceived, I actually gave a recommendation of several crystals. The first for healing, he said, use quartz, mainly because quartz seemed like a general purpose crystal. It could be used for pretty much anything that you kind of put your intent towards. He also recommended you could use two other ones. One of them was a purple one, which I believe he said was amethyst. And he described that as you could use that to help someone relax. So if, say, someone couldn't be healed, maybe they were at the end of their life, but you wanted to make them comfortable, you could use amethyst, this purple crystal, to make them feel better. Or it's like taking an aspirin is what he used as an analogy.
I have a friend who hides amethysts around the house to help his mother-in-law relax. So they work as like a chill pill, perhaps.
It's apparently what he's recommending. And the final one that he recommended was a red crystal. He didn't give me the name of this. I had to find it afterwards, but it was like a red and dark black kind of a crystal, which he related to passion and desires. So quartz, amethyst, and I think there were garnets was the red one that he all mentioned as crystals for different purposes.
So the received wisdom about how to handle these crystals, I know a lot of people like to leave them out on their windowsill during a full moon, and they say, okay, well, the moonlight is going to come and bathe them and recharge them, or I'm going to leave it out on my back porch during the solar eclipse, and then I get the solar eclipse energy. I'm really curious to know, did Thoth talk about how to charge crystals or how to treat your crystals so they work in their optimal way?
He did. Someone actually asked that question. Lore says to put crystals in the sun and it makes them better. And he responded with kind of a laugh and saying, that's ridiculous. Like, what does the sun have to do with it? He said, if you want to cleanse a crystal, it comes from your intention. That if you want to wipe it and put a new intention behind it for a new purpose, put your intention on the crystal that you'd like the program inside to be wiped. Has nothing to do with the moon or the sun. And he said superstition is for children, and that if you want to use these responsibly, then know you're the one who is the actor behind it, not some other force beyond you. And so it's a tool, is what he was describing this. He did mention that the shape of the crystal did seem to matter, that it should have a point on it somewhere. He brought up the pyramid shape as an example. It doesn't have to be exactly like a pyramid, just that it should have some sort of a pointed end somewhere that you could use to direct the energy through. He also mentioned that the way you use the crystal, no matter which kind it was, is that these are repositories. These are like batteries, and your intention is like filling up a large cup. And every time you sit down with it and you put your intention into it, it fills it up a little bit more. And then you sit down with it a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth time. And then more and more of that intention and energy goes into the crystal, which then at a later date can be expended. And so it's like a supercharged battery that can be used for intention in the future. The final thing he said about crystals was, even though it's seemingly like an inanimate object, it is a tool, the way you should interact with it is like it's something that is aware of itself. It'd be like a pet, is that you would talk to your pet like you assume it hears you. And that's how you should look at your crystal, is like, oh, this is a little puppy that's trying to please its master. You might say, good boy, this is the way I'd like you to do, sit, bark, shake my hand, things like that. That's the kind of relationship you should have with the crystal for it to work properly. And if you ever need to redo whatever program you've assigned to the crystal, you just would speak to it like it could hear you and say, purge the system, and then ask it what you'd like to do next. So it seemed really simple. There's no complex strategy here. It's just speak to it, treat it like you can hear it, and it charges up over time. All right, so crystals aside, I think this is probably a good place to wrap up this episode. Thoth had a lot of interesting things, I think, to say about several topics. It was definitely an interesting experience for me to be having this conversation with a non-corporeal Egyptian god. And I suppose take everything here with a grain of salt, certainly. This was a very unusual remote viewing session, but we hope it was an entertaining one. So if you enjoyed this episode, definitely share it with your friends. We really appreciate your support by being a subscriber to the After Hours. We will have many more interesting subjects for you in the coming weeks, so stay tuned for those. But until then, if you want to interact with us or share the show, definitely find us on our social media. We're on all major platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and the likes. So we'd love to see comments from you guys there and answer your questions. But other than that, I think this is where we wrap it up. Thank you for joining, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Take care.